Well, to put it into context, there was civil and religious disruption in England, and the Quakers were dissenters. They were amongst a group of people who were objecting to the way the country was being run and how the churches were operating. And George Fox, the founder, spoke out, and gradually there were followers, and they formed themselves into the Religious Society of Friends, commonly known as Quakers, and we call them Quakers. And because they spoke out, they became unpopular and were often clapped into jail. They then found that they needed to move, and some of them moved to Ireland. And they came mainly through Dublin, Cork and Waterford, the big ports. So the Waterford Quakers settled around 1655, and they came as small traders, farmers, with precious little, except their practices, which they felt were important, of putting their Christian beliefs into practice, which were honesty, religious tolerance, truth, equality, education. Those were the tenets. And so they settled in Waterford, not in O'Connell Street to start with, but near where people would know Wise Park. And they settled there and became small traders. They worked hard and were known for their honesty. And so over the say 150 years, as generations developed, they became successful in business. And by the, say, 1780s and 90s, they had become quite a big group, and they had 2 meeting houses in Bowling, down in Wise Park, and they also had 2 burial grounds down there. But they needed a bigger place to meet on a Sunday, and so they decided to build, and they built in what now is Garter Lane Arts Centre, and that was their meeting house, and they moved in there in 1792. So it's a big commodious building. How did they manage to build? Because they had the money. That was basically it, and they had become Quaker merchants. And so the Quaker merchants had their businesses down from George's Street to down O'Connell Street. It was known as King Street and Mary Street, and right down to what's now a brewery. And of course they were involved in the bridge. And then they were involved in businesses right up to along the quays, right up, and in fact went up to the park where Malcolmson's shipbuilders, right up to Newtown School, which was established in 1798, a big year. To put that in context, you had people, familiar names like Penrose, Jacob, Strangman, White, Grubb families, but all had their businesses down around O'Connell Street.
And Joan, when you said they came from England,
yes,
did they come from a particular part of England, or was it just what?
Mainly the western, yes, Cumberland and the west side of England.
And then,
yes.
What was the reaction of the Waterford? I mean, Waterford at that time was obviously some of the merchants would be from a Protestant background, and
yes.
then the ordinary population would be Catholic.
Yes.
What was their reaction to these Quakers coming into Waterford?
Well, funny enough, well, not funny enough, but they were on an equal footing to the Catholics, because the penal laws were there, and so there was quite a bit of a suspicion at the beginning, and because they started to talk again against the church, the established church, which was the Episcopalian church, and they would be standing outside the churches and giving out yards about, not unfamiliar to people's campaigns and protests nowadays. And so some of them were clapped into jail here and were sent packing back to Bristol. But really, they were allowed settle. And they were allowed settle within the walls of Waterford, round Wise Park. And because they were able to work hard, they started to integrate.
But I suppose it's interesting now because they were refugees.
Yes,
and
yes.
how they were. It's interesting to see how they were assimilated or how they got on with the local community that became.
Well, you see, they were amongst the Catholic population, as it were, and but they were allowed settle, and they developed their relationship with the local people. That was it. They were hard workers, and I must say that. And the other thing is that they wouldn't take an oath of allegiance to the king, and so this precluded them to go to university. And so their options were to go into business, whereas the other social groups would have been maybe landowners, and they maybe would have gone into the army. Of course, the peace would be something that the Quakers wouldn't have done that. But basically, they rolled up their sleeves and got on with it. Mm-hmm.
And they didn't sign contracts. It was always their handshake was their.
Their yay was their yay, and their nay was their nay, and yay. And this would have been obvious in the courts because people were asked to swear on the Bible, and when the Quaker went in, he wouldn't swear on the Bible. He said his yay was yay. He was honest all the time, not just because he put the hand on the Bible. Yes.
And then what would an actual Quaker service be? What would that be? What would that consist of?
Well, it's one of silence. They would have their own meeting houses, and there's a lovely book on the Ireland's Quaker meeting houses. So you go in, and it's at a certain time. It's for the public, so anybody is welcome. And usually, well, in the old days, it was in benches, and it's in complete silence. And you centre down and look for the Spirit of God or the light within, and you focus on that. And then sometimes then anybody is welcome to speak, and you will have ministry. It could be something out of the Bible, it could be a prayer, it could be a hymn, or it could be an original thought. And that is, I think, the essence within the Quaker society, that they would be thinking of the revelation within, and they would then speak and share that. And then somebody else might then take that message up. It lasts for about an hour. In our own current meeting house, which is in Newtown, it's at 10 o'clock, and at 10 o'clock the young children go into a junior meeting, and that is organised for the youngsters, and they come in then at about a quarter of an hour before the end, so everybody then is gathered. It's very, very simple.
And also the burial is very simple, aren't they?
Yes, yes. I mean, there's no hierarchy, equality, and it's a very democratic religious group. It's quite hard. It's really do-it-yourself kind of thing, because you have to work at it yourself, and that's the freedom of it, I think. And that's why I think quite a number of people are interested now in it, and we're getting quite a lot of what we call attenders coming to the meet, because they're disillusioned with their own church. So there is no hierarchy, and everybody has to take part in the business side of things as well, and take responsibility.
And do you remember
yes.
you said that they were involved in all different industries, right?
Yes.
I mean, what about things like, I mean, you mentioned what was the family that were involved in the brewery?
The Strangman.
Would they not have, would there not be a conflict there with regards alcohol or anything like that? Or?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The Strangmans came in the late 1700s, okay, and they set up a brewery. And quite a lot of Quakers were in milling at that stage, and therefore the product would have been produced and gone on to produce beer. And it's all to do with the water. It was better to drink beer at that stage. It's safer than the water. And so they felt that was all right. And in fact, I have records from the Newtown archives that beer was served to the pupils there. Now, that was fine at the early stage, but then they found that the drinking and Father Matthews and his temperance brought up the awareness of the alcohol dangers, and so they certainly at that stage in the mid-1800s they withdrew from, some of the Strangman family in fact withdrew from the business there, and a lot of the Quakers all over the British Isles at that stage would have become very anti-drinking, yes, and temperance would have been the word, yes.
So Joan, can we go through some of the individual families and some of the locations?
Yes. Well, I'm really excited to be able to share this information with you, because we're at the hub really of when the Quakers became merchants after 150 years or so, and were decided to really settle here. And why did they settle here? Because of the quays, because of the ships and the business that curtailed. There would have been ships going from the quays over to Bristol, down to Europe, over to Newfoundland. And from our Quaker records we can see, for example, Courtney and Ridgway, which are not familiar names, were big butter and pork exporters. And they owned some ships, and they lived, or their business was in George's Street, very near George's Court. And they're a family that I want to do more research on. So if you think of George's Street there, and then if you come along to the lovely Chamber of Commerce building, they didn't have anything to do with building that building because it was William Morris building, but that is where they met. And if you look, and it would be well worth taking a look at a lovely scroll there of all the names of the presidents of the chamber. It's littered with the names of the early Waterford Quaker merchants. So there's a connection there. And then if you come on up to the Garter Lane, and Garter Lane again was the Quaker meeting house former. And when we came in the 1960s, that was where the Quaker meeting was. And it was a ghastly building at that stage. It was too big for us. But you see, if you look back in 1790s, well, they built that big place because the numbers were there. And they also built it not on the streetscape, but they brought it back. And if you notice, you have to go through the archway up. And the Quakers weren't pushy. There would have been no proselytizing, for example. You have to go and find the Quakers, really. And so they, rather than putting an imposing building right on the streetscape, they pushed it back. So they bought land and built this house, meeting house. And I would love to know, I still don't know who designed and built it. Perhaps it was John Roberts, I don't know. But he built Newtown, he built the Wise House, which was Newtown School, and he was active. But I'd have to check my dates there for that. But they built a huge, and if you go into the Theatre Royal, the theatre there, that was their huge meeting house. I remember walking into it, and
Garter Lane.
Sorry, Garter Lane.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, Garter Lane. Going in there, and on the left-hand side was where we had our Quaker meeting, that exhibition.
Gallery.
On the left, yes, exhibition gallery. But on the right, there was this huge big room, which was not used at that stage, but it had a massive, big auditorium, and also a gallery going around the whole lot, the sides of it. So, and from our records, we could see that maybe there were 500 or 600 people attending for special meetings during the year, and so they needed the numbers were quite big at that stage. And also they had land at the back. In fact, it's called Meeting House Lane, so that was the end of it. And they had also land for their horses and carts and stables on the left as well. So that's Garter Lane, and so it remained as a meeting house till the 1960s, and then it was really not fit for purpose, and so it was decided to look for somewhere else, and they built up in Newtown, and the corporation bought the meeting house from the Quakers. And it was used for some time as a courthouse, a temporary courthouse, and then now it is this magnificent art gallery now. So that's the meeting house. So if you go along further, on the left-hand side, you come to a very interesting number 3, I think it's called, O'Connell Street, and this was where the Jacob family started. There was Joseph and Hannah Jacob, and they had about 13 or 14 children, and it's from them that 3 strands or branches of the Jacob family came settled, and you would know the Jacobs biscuits. That was one section. The other was the Jacobs that had an iron foundry on the quay. I think it's 46. I think it is now an outdoor shop there. And then, so they were iron foundries, and they had, for example, they produced the gates and all the ironwork railings around the courthouse. And if you look at some of the manholes around Waterford, you'll see Jacob on them. And I got recently, somebody rang up and said, I found one in Tramore, a Jacob one. So you have the biscuits, then you had the iron foundry, and they were into heating and plumbing as well. And there is a lovely photograph of the shop, the front shop, which is interesting, because they were hardware at the front, but they had a big foundry at the back. And then the other Jacob branch went into banking and land agency, and I think they were Boat or Lloyd's shipping company here in Waterford. Very interesting family. So that is in number 3, and if you go down on, you'll see a blue plaque, and that was put up by the Civic Trust only last year, and it's a fine Georgian house. It's double-doored with steps up to it. You can't miss it.
And where was the actual? You mentioned the bakery, the Jacob's biscuits.
Oh yes.
Where was their location?
Yeah, that was in Bridge Street.
Okay. So,
do you know the Dominican Church?
yeah.
Well, just the the side away from the river, the bakery was there. And that was started, and William and Robert Jacob then went on.
And it was biscuits was for merchants, for seamen, wasn't it? For sailors and all that.
They started that. Now, William and Robert had a mother, Anne, and Isaac, and they started the bakery there. They came from O'Connell Street and went round the corner and started a small bakery, and used to do bracks and stuff like that. And then William and came along, and Robert, and they could see that they were baking bread for the boats, etc. But it was going mouldy very quickly. So they experimented. They were entrepreneurs, really. And they experimented and did this double bake biscuit so that it became really crispy. And then it didn't go off and get mouldy. So that's the start of the famous Jacob biscuit. But that was only the start of it, because they then went into all sorts of fancy biscuits, and they opened a shop on the quays and sold their biscuits. And by 1850s, they were feeling they needed to expand, so they moved to Dublin, and the rest is history. They bought a huge place near Peter Street, off Ainger Street there. And I remember as a child, because I was born and bred in just a couple of streets, and you could, if you walk past Jacob's, you could smell the smell of the bakery there. So, but that's Bridge Street, and really there should be a blue plaque up there.
It's an amazing story.
Yeah, so
and then
yes.
The banking side was on Gladstone Street, as we call it.
Yes. As
the old penny bank.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and I'm not so. I haven't done my full history of that up to now, to be honest with you. But I know at some stage, the very building that we're in, the Savings Bank, I know some of the Strangman family were involved in it. And this, where we are now, of course, is this wonderful Waterford Municipal Art Collection, which is housed, and I understand this was a savings bank, but I am not. I know that the Penny Bank was in Gladstone Street, and that was part of the Jacob family, and people, I think, remember it to this day as regards how they set up this bank so that they could just have the ordinary people go in, and again they were trusted, and would just put some small amount each week away, and it went for years, as far as I know. So that was in Gladstone Street.
Which fitted into the Quaker ethos, isn't it?
Oh yes.
Savings,
yes.
And
yes.
entrepreneur.
Yes.
All that kind of stuff.
And they were very, very strict on how you do your finances. And we would have records of where Quaker businesses got into trouble and maybe weren't paying their debts. They would actually be disowned. I mean, they were very strict. You had to perform financially in a correct way, and you would never overspend, or take financial risk. They were entrepreneurs and could see where money was to be made, but they were very strict. And so we have a lot of records of people around in Waterford who were actually thrown out because they hadn't paid their debts. Now they wouldn't, it would be a process, they would be given a warning, but there's huge records there of people who and also not only debts, but they were very strict in the 1700s. They went through a very strict disciplinarian time because they didn't want the drink, they didn't want dancing or gambling, So if people demeaned, I have a record of a Dorothea Penrose who fancied to go dancing, and she was disowned. Now, she was rapped over the knuckles a few times, you see, because there'd be these elders who would go and talk to them and say, look, you have to mind your ways. This isn't how the Quakers work. But I have a beautiful piece about her, and that was the demise, really, of the decrease in the numbers of Quakers. They lost a huge amount of membership, because if you look at it from a social point of view, they came 1650s. By the late 1700s, they were getting wealthy. Third generation were starting to like the money and wanting to go out into, up to then, a quite internalised group. Now were wanting to go out socially, and the young ones, for example, wanted to go dancing, and they wanted to engage with. And this group, still disciplinarians, wouldn't let go. And so we lost a huge amount of people for various reasons. And a lot then married into the Church of Ireland. The other thing is, which I hadn't mentioned, was that you had to marry a Quaker up to the late 1800s, and if you did marry, not in a meeting house, in a Quaker meeting house, but you married, say, in Church of Ireland or Catholic, you were disowned. Very, very harsh. Very harsh. So, it wasn't all a bed of roses.
Strangmans.
Oh, yes.
The brewery, tell us about that.
Well, they were fascinating. I think they came in 1770s. They came from Mount Mellick area down. Now, what you have to understand too is there was a lot of intermarriage, you see. So Strangman and maybe a daughter of a Strangman might have met a Jacob at a Quaker meeting, and these marriages were encouraged to connect big families and their businesses too. And they would have had big families, you see. So the Strangmans came to Waterford, and they set up a brewery up at the end of Mary Street there. And they were very successful. In fact, I think it has been a continuous brewery since the 1770s, right up to the present day. And I went to see the brewery recently, and some of the old areas are still there. Can you imagine that they made the beer, and it's wonderful to see it's still there. And the Strangmans built some of those houses. They're quite big houses coming up to the entrance to the brewery. So the Strangmans settled there and became successful. And again, they went in not only to brewing, but they went into export and of other goods and into shipping. They teamed up with Strangman Davis and the Penroses and worked there. Now, there's very interesting people that have come out of that family. One was a Joshua William Strangman, which I have to mention, and he was secretary of the Friends Relief Committee during the famine, and he worked ardently here in Waterford. People said, oh, there was no famine in Waterford. There was. I have records of 2 Quaker soup kitchens being established, one on the Quays and one on the Fanning Institute, which is now a tax office. And the women would have organised these daily big soup kitchens, and there were streams and streams of people coming up during the height of the famine. So that's Joshua William, he's one of my heroes, and he also connected down in Ring, and he helped the people of Ring with a Reverend Alcock, and there's a huge story there. In fact, I've been down there a few times, and some of the people who would be historically au fait would say that only for the Waterford Quakers, Ring would not be now as it is, that they saved Ring. They gave them donations, they gave them loans for boats, and they gave them food. So that's Joshua William. But the other one I want to mention...
Sorry, Joshua William, was he from the Strangmans in Mary Street?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, he was. And he eventually... He eventually lived actually up on Ferrybank, and I think his house is still there. I think it's called Zion Lodge. I've never got up to it yet. I keep meaning to go up to it. He never married, and I understand he was a director of the savings banks. That's the one thing I do know, and that I was told recently that he gave permission for the top floor of this building to be an art school, the start of the art school in Waterford. So that's him. But the other person that I must mention is a Dr. Mary Strangman, again from that family. That family moved out to Carriganore, that branch of the family, and that Carriganore is where Wit is now, and all that lovely area. You can see the house is still there. If you're walking past the Greenway, you can see it up on the left. And Mary Strangman became a doctor, and she was one of the first students to go into the College of Surgeons, along with her sister Lucia. And there's a whole story there about her. And she was the first woman to be elected to the Waterford City Council. And she's a very interesting lady.
And so did she work as a doctor then in the local hospital?
Yes, okay. Yes. She did. She came back, and she never married. She devoted her whole life to the public health service. She worked as a GP down in Parnell Street. She also was involved in the Waterford Maternity Hospital in Parliament Street. There's a plaque there to her, and she was also a campaigner for the eradication of TB. She was a doctor for the poor, and she was also the doctor for Newtown School. And her portrait is now hanging in the Royal College of Surgeons. Last year, I had to give some so she was identified as one of 8 women whose portraits were to be painted in recognition of the women's contribution from last year. And so I went up with some of the Strangman family that are still here, and we had a great day and saw her portrait. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, what are families or houses in this area that you can talk about in relation to Quakers? Right.
Well, we've done the Strangmans, and then Bridge Street, the Jacobs there, and in that area too, the Penroses, William and George Penrose, the nephew and uncle, started Waterford Glass Works. And that area is around where the Bridge Tracy's Hotel is, and they started there. So that's the Penroses, and they started there. Now they seem to also be into property and renting out houses and warehouses. So they must have had a big tranche of property down there. They later went into Glasshouse Lane, which there's a Penrose Lane crossing O'Connell Street, and if you go up there and on the right, the Penroses And so that would be I'd need a whole day to talk about the Penroses, but basically that's where they were, starting near the bridge and then moving up as well. They also had a shop to sell their wares in.
And I know a lot of their glass influenced the later Waterford crystal designs. Like their designs were very interesting to Penroses, wasn't it?
Yes, they were. They were ahead of their time, as a lot of the Quakers were. They were entrepreneurs and they could see what would be good for business, and so they started the glass. And I mean, Waterford glass now is known all over the world, and they started them. The company there, and it was a small venture to start, but they were able to advertise and market very well, and the glass then was eventually sought by all the highest levels. For example, it's in Westminster Abbey and in many fancy houses around, and that name and the brand has kept. It's called Waterford Crystal. It was called Waterford Glassworks at the start, and so there's a huge history there, and it was very successful. But then it closed, and it wasn't until the 1950s when Batchik came, and there was, I think, Lamass had a huge effort to try to bring industry in, and so what we're seeing now, and all that activity for Waterford and the Waterford glass, that started in the 1950s. So there was a gap, all right, but it went on, and it's legendary now. Yes, so that's the Penroses. So we've talked about the Jacobs. Now I did skip a house which is next to the Jacobs, which people would recognise as George White's. It was a chemist on the corner, just as you're passing, before you come to Thomas Hill, I think it is, or Thomas Street. George White's. Again, a huge history there. A member of the White family came to Waterford and started trading as a small hardware and grocery, and eventually it became a chemist. That's in latter years, but before that they had become interested in shipping, and Albert White started this massive shipbuilding, and it was a golden era for the wooden boats, and his dock was on the far side of the quays, and he built a house which was up to recently a hotel called the Athenaeum. So that was the house of the Whites. But the docks there, and Bill Irish in his book has a huge amount about the Whites and their shipbuilding. They were huge employers. So it started over in a small little shop in O'Connell Street, and then the father, when he died, there were two sons. Albert took the shipbuilding, and George took the shop, and the shop was then developed into hardware, rope building, ropes making, anything to do with the ships. But then they came into being chemists, and when we came to Waterford, that was our chemist shop, and they had quite a bit of land at the back as well. And the facade of that is still there. I have photographs, internal photographs actually, of that, which is fantastic. Wooden floors and big counters of wood. It was a huge, massive area. That's all gone. I think that inside, but the facade is there. So that's whites. Opposite them then there was the Hills, and they were grocers, and again in the 1960s that was our grocery shop. Opposite it is now, or up to recently, Grub and Co. And of course the Grubs were involved with the chemists, because Grub married into the Whites, and that became a pharmacy. But Grub and Co. was a wonderful, before Hills were a grocer shop, and I used to, again in the 60s, I could go in there, I could ring up and actually order what I wanted, and it on a Friday, and it would be delivered that afternoon. So, all this delivery was being done in the 1960s. Incredible. So that's just a place I wanted to mention. But I have to mention an Albert Bell. If you think of going down to George White's and continuing on towards the brewery, on the left-hand side of that property, there was a man called Albert Bell, and he started hostels for the destitute. He set up 4 of them with his wife Anne, and one of them was down there. I don't know exactly yet what particular number it is, but they had 4, and they set them up in about the 1880s, and they lasted a good while. And there was one in O'Connell Street, one in Henrietta Street, one in Exchequer Street, and Adelphi Quay. And so why was he doing it? Because there was a huge amount of poor, just like we have the homeless now. And he set up these hostels. And I brought with me actually a little bit about what they, how it functioned. He rented the houses, and he put in rooms for men. It was men only. And there was one year, and I think it was in the 1930s, when in total there was something like 16,000 bed nights for men in Waterford. And again, I'd love to do a whole essay on that, but it was to be very strictly run. They had to pay something like 3 pence for the night, but it got them off the streets, and these were unemployed, and also people that to do with the boats, and maybe sailors who'd come in and didn't have a place to stay. And so they also set up the Munster dining room, which was, again, for cheap food, hot food, and that was more or less where, in Michael Street, where Dunstores is. And it was a restaurant, and there was 2 sections to the restaurant. The lower section was where people could come in, bring their own billy can, and be given soup, and could go back into the tenements or whatever. And on the top, there was a fancy restaurant, and the business people could go up there, and there would be white tablecloths and silver service, and that paid for the food that was given. Now, it wasn't given free. The Quakers never gave free relief. You always had to pay something, whether it was a penny or 2 pence for the thing, because they felt that was demeaning if you gave it out. And often they would give vouchers. They were quite crafty. They wouldn't give money to people, but they would give a voucher, say, for the Munster Dining Hall, where the person then could go in, and no money, because if the Quakers would be thinking they might be spending it on the drink.
Yeah. Bewley's coffee, they were the coffee people, weren't they?
Yes.
Because I saw a photograph of a Bewley's advertisement in Waterford railway station and up in Ballybricken in the fairground.
Right.
That they were selling coffee back 100 years ago in Waterford.
Yes.
So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and personally, I'm married to one of the descendants of the Bewleys, my husband Roger, and Joshua Bewley set up in the 1840s, okay, a tea and coffee merchant business in Dublin, just near Temple Bar. It's amazing, just down there. And he started as a small tea and coffee merchant, and they then expanded. And Roger's grandfather, Ernest Bewley, he actually developed the Grafton Street Bewleys, and and then they were distributing it. So you're right that they were all over the place. They were, and they still are. There's still Bewley's coffee being sold. If you go into any of the supermarkets, you'll find we drink it still. It was a sad day for the family when it closed, but it's still there.
I know you mentioned the hills.
Yes.
The hills, were they the same hills for the salt importers and all that? Charles James Hill?
Charles James, yeah, that was the name of the, yes.
They had a big salt place in Patrick Street.
No.
When I was a child.
Right, well there, I'm learning something to see. And I know Robert Hill, whose father would have run the shop I was talking to, Charles Hill. Yeah, it's all connected. Yeah. They're all they diversified too, and that's something I'm learning. For example, I haven't mentioned Walpoles. They were rope makers as well. It was all tied in as well and they were connecting with each other, and they do business.
Where was the Walpoles? Where were they?
That was on the Quays as well. Off the top of my head, I just can't remember, but I have a feeling it might be round where the granary. I still have to work on that granary building. I think there's a Quaker connection in there. Do you know that big building that is now, I think, the School of Architecture? So you have, I think I've told you about the Whites, and of course Timber Toes. They were involved in putting up money for that, and also the railways. I mean, there is a post. I don't know whether you've seen and I haven't seen it yet. A big poster called to do in the station, the railway station, and it has aspects, of Waterford. Newtown School is there,
yeah.
And the railways. A lot of money was put in by the Quakers for the railways all over Ireland. They could see that this is how you had to transport.
Because
yes.
At that time the railway companies were private companies.
Yes. Oh yes.
There was
yes.
no public money involved.
No. And so you had shares from various people. And you know the Goodbody name, for example, now, and the jute factory, you see, that was a Quaker family, and they came from Clara and were into making jute, and they were big employers over the years. They were still there.
So let's see. I just want that man stand and say to him, we're okay. So, yeah. And sorry, just go back to I'm just trying to think now about the move from over by Wise Park over to this end. Wasn't there something where originally when the Quakers came to Waterford, everything had to be inside the city walls, and then eventually they moved out, they broke open the walls here to create O'Connell Street and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Was that at that time or was it before that?
I'm not a historian.
Okay.
I really couldn't tell you.
Okay.
I can tell you about what I know, but I'm not. I don't.
Don't worry about it.
I don't know. I don't know about that. But all I know is the land was must have been available here to see and for development. And the other thing is about the Jacobs on the Quays, and they became builders as well. And I understand that they built a lot of the houses behind the meeting house and going up to Ballybrick, and you know those ones that are like artisan ones. There was a builder, Thomas Whitejacob. He did a lot of building, and he built houses up Newtown. And it's interesting that the Quakers lived above the shop at the stage, see? And so they would have lived, the Whites lived above the shops and the hills and the wall poles and etc. And then, because they got quite fancy, they wanted better houses. So a lot of them moved up to Newtown. Or when the railway was in 1869, the Waterford Tramore Railway was built, some of them moved out to Tramore. So they built quite commodious houses up the Newtown Road and out in Tramore. And then you'd have, for example, Strangman living out in Carganore, you see, and others around the Ridgeways. There were other houses.
And you mentioned the Malcolmsons earlier on for the boat builders.
Yes.
They weren't down this end town, it was all down by the park,
yes.
down by the Cannon Street.
Yes.
And did they live down there as well?
No, they lived in Portlaw.
Okay.
Now, Portlaw was laid out by the Malcolmsons as a sort of a village. David Malcolmson came down from Clonmel. The Malcolmsons originally were from Clonmel. There's a very interesting book about the Portlaw story, and there's a lovely interpretive centre out there. It's well worth going out to see. But briefly, David Malcolmson, the story is that he was passing through Portlaw and he saw this stream, and there was a waterfall, and he said, that's a good place to put a wheel. And so he developed this huge factory, and laid out the village, put in schools, and those houses are still there, and set up a cotton factory there, built canals, and laid down the whole social structure out there, the Quakers. And then they went into shipbuilding, and so they couldn't build their ships up there, so they produced them down at the site. Just the actual site, and again there should be a plaque up there sometime. The People's Park, and there's a garage just opposite it, all behind that, and that's where they made their boats and launched.
That's great. Joan, could we get some shots of the stuff that you brought? The Harveys, just tell us about Harveys and the printing family and company.
Yes. Well, again, Harvey, people would know the name Harvey Bristol Cream. And so the Harveys came from Bristol and settled in Waterford, but they became printers here. And they settled and had their printing works, certainly on the quays. As far as I know, it was 55 merchant quays. And they had, there's this wonderful autobiography of Newnham Harvey, and he's written his memoirs, and he describes his work there. And he went to Newtown School, as a lot of these merchants' children would have gone, and he seemed to be very interested in travelling, but he set up and kept the Harvey going round the time of the famine. And I remember once when he said he went with his father to help him with the soup kitchens, and he describes something like 900 people being served soup each day up in Fanning Institute with his father, and he was only a young fellow of about 12 then. But he certainly started to develop the printers, and they became very successful in Merchants Quay, and also I think they were also somewhere else, maybe in George's Street as well. They again lived over the shop, but moved up to Newtown, and in fact Newnham Harvey built a house which is on the Newtown Road. It's called Cove Lodge. It's on the left. It's a red bricked house, and his life is very interesting. So the Harvey continued when we came in the 1960s. They were going fully, and as far as I know, they're still in business, not in Quaker hands, but out in the Waterford business place out.
And just a quick question, Joan. Do you know, in relation to Newtown, was it a boarding school always, or was it a day school for all these Quaker families?
Yes, it was boarding from the word go, and they bought it and set it up and opened it in 1798 with about 36 boarders, and they all lived in the one main building upstairs, girls and boys, because the education for the girls was just as important as the boys, so it was always boarding, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, that's it. No, well, to see, it developed from 36 at that stage, but it was only for Quaker children at this stage. And it was boarding, and the children had to work. It was a farm. It was a working farm as well, so they learned lots of skills and the basics, writing, etc. And it then developed and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was, my husband taught there and went to school there. And so we would have seen the development up to the present day. And when he went, it was a private school. But the Quakers weren't so keen to have it still to become an exclusive school. So they went into the government free scheme about 4 or 5 years ago.
Well, isn't it still the kind of ethos of the Quakers to help in the local community and to help needy causes and all that kind of stuff? Like that?
It is indeed, and they would, I mean, the relief work that was done in the famine and the ethos of that and helping is still there. And rather than a group of the Quakers doing things like they did in the famine, it would be more individuals would be in the Samaritans and in various other groups around. And it has shifted, you see, the Quaker firms aren't there anymore. You see, that's a whole question. Why, you see, why did they go? And I wouldn't be an expert on that, but it interests me. But the school is still there, and it has developed. And the ethos, it's run by, the patron body is Quaker. It's owned still by, the whole school is owned by the Quakers. Okay. The patron body, the ethos is there of equality and tolerance and a democratic way and the good relationship with the pupils and the teachers and a community base. And it's a boarding, and that's very important to have that element. They hopefully it'll continue. We've had loads of different interesting people there, very creative people that want to contribute. And one that pleases me recently is Boucher Hayes, Philip Boucher Hayes. He did one recently on the climate. I mean, he went to Newton, I remember him, and many others, poets and writers and singers and people that are interested in improving the community. Yeah.
Okay. Joan, thanks a million.
Oh, listen.